Last but not least, we asked Stan Ahalt from UNC Chapel Hill to come and try to provide closing remarks to all of this wonderful science and ideas and discussions that we had. And I'm very glad to have Stan as a faculty colleague at UNC, and I can tell you I had zero to do to putting him on the agenda. I actually have never met Stan before because he's at a very interesting organization, which is Renaissance Supercomputing Initiative at UNC, which is not necessarily on campus, and he's that behind-the-scenes person who's providing all the supercomputing power to us as faculty at the University of North Carolina. But Stan has a great background and pedigree, and we're happy to have him at UNC after all of the years that he spent at Ohio State University.
Indeed.
Thank you, Stan.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I can only hope that he is glad that I'm his colleague at the end of these remarks. So I'm Stan Ahalt. I'm the director of the Renaissance Computing Institute. I'm also a professor of computer science at UNC Chapel Hill. And by what I would call a fluke of nature, I'm the director of the bioinformatics core at the School of Medicine. And I'm actively looking to hire somebody to replace myself. So if you know anybody, please send them my way. I am not a bioinformatician. I just play one on TV. I was tasked by the meeting's organizers, and I am well aware of the fact that I stand between you and lunch or you and travel, so I'll try to be quick. I have a tendency to talk quickly anyway. So I could only imagine how fast I'm going to talk. I was tasked to summarize what I've heard during the last 2 days, and then perhaps stimulate a little further thought and discussion around possible next steps. And I've framed the next steps in kind of a broad way because I think that we've already heard some of these ideas previously. So just to calibrate you where I'm coming from, RENCI, the Renaissance Computing Institute, basically was chartered by the 3 R1s in the triangle, Duke, NC State, and UNC Chapel Hill, to use cyber infrastructure, supercomputing, visualization, data analytics, you name it, to accelerate the path of scientific discovery. And we primarily do this, we do it for almost anybody that asks if we can, but we primarily do it in the health sciences and in the environmental and coastal sciences. So not really in the environmental health, although you could easily imagine a gear that sits right between these two, maybe has a chemistry pointing into it or something like their biochemistry. So I actually have had a renaissance in my own career in looking at these very different fields from what I was previously accustomed to. Most of my work previously was DoD signal processing, where I would characterize my research as shoot it, don't shoot it. And that was a very interesting space, but I'm not shooting at anything now other than trying to solve some interesting problems. And so each of these things are kind of reasonably good size initiatives that are underway at RENCI. And that's, I put this up here not to talk about RENCI, but to give you an idea where I'm coming from, because it's a somewhat different perspective. So here's my overly simplistic, I completely admit, summary of what I've heard in the last few days, and it's going to go on for slide after slide. I might add, I've made up these slides in the back of the room. There's almost no slide here that hasn't been made up. There's maybe 5 of them, the previous one being one of them. So if the slides are a little crude, forgive me, this was being done on the fly. So I think that there are 3 kind of categories that I've heard things fall into. Data is very easy to generate, to collect. It's easy to view it as a common good, and it's easy to accumulate. So there's some things that are pushing on us in some good ways, but they have, it's a yin and yang situation. I would argue that from what I heard, we're getting better or even good at dealing with some real well-resourced data. The ENCODE project, Large Hadron Collider, there's other examples where we go out knowing that we're going to have to deal with the data, and so we have a very intelligent plan to deal with it. We're also doing a very good job of analyzing data in very creative ways. That's one of the things that I took away from this meeting is that people are looking at things that I had kind of thought people ought to look at, and indeed they are. Okay, I think we're getting much better at realizing the utility of secondary and tertiary data. So we're starting to move in those directions. But I would argue that, and again, this is overly simplistic, but data is still hard to make findable because you have to add stuff to it in order to do that. It's hard to share because of our proclivities, sometimes at least. It's hard to manage. It's hard to make understandable, again, metadata that is required. It's hard to sustain. It's hard to value. And I'm going to come back to the 5 V's. I know you hate them, but I got to have them. And it's hard to cite. and it's hard to control. These security and privacy issues are subtle, nuanced, and as far as I can tell, there's no body or collection of bodies that are directly addressing this issue in an aggressive fashion, and as a result, it's the wild, wild west out there. There are some obvious things we lack. So listening to the themes here, and I hope I did a good job of capturing this, we still lack a robust shared cyber infrastructure. We're getting there, but we really don't have the tools, the infrastructure that we need. We don't really have broadly shared meta collections, and I used Amazon as an example of, here's a storefront. Everybody goes to it to buy stuff, but they're selling for a whole bunch of different vendors. So they've made their interface available so you can plug your data in and sell your stuff. And it's an interesting model that I use over and over with my colleagues. Why don't we think about building something where it's very easy to search and find data on this particular type of compound or data on this particular disease path, okay? We also are still lacking, getting better, but lacking widely used sets of robust tools. I'm thinking Google Docs is kind of an example that everybody knows about. Here's a set of tools that have evolved over time. We've gotten better and better as more people have used them. We know how to communicate using Google Docs. My university is not keen on me using that to grade and do things because it's out there in the open, but it's an interesting set of tools, and unless we start thinking about building those kind of shared tools, I think we'll have missed the mark somewhat. Now, despite these challenges, I think we have done a remarkable job of cranking out data collections and creating them and curating them and using them, and I think the consequences are something that we should pat ourselves on the back. So I took all the slides. They're in Dropbox. I asked one of my colleagues back at Renzi, spend your morning this morning looking through all the collections that are mentioned. We probably got them wrong, but we Googled each one of them to try to make sure it was a collection, so we can edit it. That's a lot of collections. I think the community here should be proud of the fact that they, have somehow managed to get a lot of stuff collected. Now, interoperating among those collections is a different issue, and maybe that's would be an interesting thing to do, is to see if this is reasonably complete. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then ask yourself, is there a way we can group it together and start thinking about the things that we do want to coalesce, around these names? And I'm just putting this up notionally instead of a hairball. This is a list ball or something. I don't know what it is. It's an impressive list. As an outsider, I was struck by the fact that this is an incredibly productive community for the common good. And despite these challenges, there's been a great deal of excellent research in science. Papers, I looked at the paper production rate. You guys are cranking out papers faster and faster. So, whatever this community is doing, don't stop doing it. You just need to do it faster because we need you. Incredible innovation. Carolyn's CDT relationships that are getting close to looking like an algebra. You can think about, working with a mathematician and figuring out how do you, what are the 6 axioms of this particular data set. Cohen-Hubble's relationship diagrams and actor, I was struck by the innovation there, and Richard's efforts to quantify the structures that give rise to properties. That's something I've been thinking about for a long time, that we need to figure out some really robust way, because when all is said and done, those primal forces of nature on those molecules is what makes everything happen. Now, our problems and our opportunities have arisen from technology. Plain and simple. You've probably seen this graph before. I used these numbers earlier. This is what has happened over the past, say, 20 years, from 86 to 2006. This is the cost of a gigabyte of disk. Started at $100,000 a gigabyte. We're down at a dime. Okay, actually lower than that now if you carry it out. But it's not that much lower because we kind of slowed down at the bottom. Okay, and as a result, paper has plummeted, thank goodness, and digital data has plummeted. And this stops at 2006. Okay, it just kept going, and it's getting faster. So the rate of production of digital data is increasing. And I want to talk about that as a theme that we need to think about. So now we have big data, the 5 V's: volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and value. I believe that there is some ways that we can start to think about, there are some ways that we can start to think about valuing data so that we have some idea of, when we collect it, what can we do with it in the longer term? What is the life cycle of this particular collection likely to look at? Now, the reason these are overly simplistic, and I completely agree that this reductionist look at this stuff is sometimes can lead you down the wrong path, is that the data use cases are very heterogeneous. So you look at any one big data set or even one non-big data set, and the 5 V's vary in their importance. And I also would observe that data management, analytics, hardware, and expertise. It was pointed out that the expertise to be able to make the intersection between the scientist and the infrastructure is critically important. And that is a very significant lack in our ecosystem, if you will, that we don't have enough of those people that can bridge between the infrastructurist and the scientist. And furthermore, our problems are social. That came up very strongly yesterday, and it's come up over and over again. We're cats, not dogs. You know, we tend to not run in herds and play together well. We tend to do whatever the heck we want. We hoard data because it used to be scarce, so it's almost primal that we have to hold on to it because it gives us an advantage. We'll be able to survive during the winter if we hold on to this data. We lack the mechanisms, financial and social, to unify the small and the large data communities, but I am absolutely convinced from my work at RENCI that a huge amount of the innovation comes from the long tail of science. People working on smaller databases are going to influence the large collections profoundly. We've got to figure out a way to somehow harmonize across this. And I would argue that the other real problem is change is hard. It's hard for all of us to do anything different than the way we've become accustomed. And the other problem is that every discipline has a different perspective on the problem. So it's the classic elephant, and that everybody sees a different aspect of this problem, and we have to work on all these problems to some degree. Now, you can't boil the ocean, so you're going to have to figure out how to pace yourself through this process. So I would argue that, so a lot of my talks now, I don't say big data, I say big in parentheses data, because I want to emphasize that we can't just think about big data. Big data is just a driver right now. These challenges require very thoughtful approaches to work through the social issues, to build better algorithms and visualizations, to improve the data management techniques, to lower the equipment and staffing costs, to develop the workforce, critically important. We've got to make sure that data has the status of a science so that we start to use scientific methods to accumulate a body of knowledge. And actually my team at RENCI went through a little competition, and we defined data science. We read all the papers we could find, and this is what it boiled down to. The systematic study of the organization and use of digital data in order to accelerate research discoveries, improve critical decision-making process, and enable a data-driven economy. There's something in there for everybody. Okay? So my shtick now is data science. Now, I want to switch to a little aspect of data science. Alan did an interesting thing on the first talk, or second talk, I guess, talking about how much data there is out there, and his comment was we're about at 1.8 zettabytes a year in production of data. Okay, so I called up my guys last night and had them run into the floor and go look up on our disk how much does it cost if we put 1.8 zettabytes on disks, which you don't put it all on disk, but let's just use that thought experiment. How much power are we burning on the data we're producing? Remember, we're getting more data every year now. Okay. Well, it turns out it's about $13.8 billion a year to just power those disks to hold that data. And some of it's on your laptop, some of it's in my shop, some of it's at Amazon. But that's still a lot of power. Remember, that generation of power is producing pollutants. It's got all kinds of interesting energy issues, water issues. Energy and water go together in a data center. The reason there's 7 or 8 big data centers in North Carolina is because we've got water, we've got power, and the water's cheap and the power's cheap. Okay, so when you talk to Siri on your Apple iPhone, all your data comes to North Carolina. Okay, so this stuff costs money. Now let's look at this cost from a different perspective. 10 petabytes will do approximately 100,000 full human genomes at low coverage. 2 petabytes, 100,000 at medium coverage. So for the UNC healthcare system, we were running these thought experiments. It's going to cost us between $5 and $25 million just to buy disks to store the data. Okay, has nothing to do with including archive copies, analysis of the data sets. Just to buy, you got to buy these disks every 3 years approximately. I'm an infrastructure guy, so I know these rules of thumb and how fast this stuff is going to turn over. So that's about $15 to $75 billion to store for the U.S. to store all every patient's data. And when we really start looking at how we're going to do end-to-end clinical genomics informatics, I did not make up this slide today in the back of the room. Okay, this is a project that's underway that RENCI is helping Jim Evans in the School of Medicine work on. And basically, it's how do we go end-to-end from the blood draw to the decision by the physician in the clinic with the patient in front of them to tell them something about their genome. We actually are doing this now. I think we have about 1,000 patients sequenced, and we're starting to amass enough statistical evidence on the variants to make some decisions about tell them, don't tell them, we're not sure of the legal issues, hold on, it might change tomorrow, and you know, all of those things are squishy, and we're trying to figure this stuff out. And this is a massive data problem, trying to figure out how to do all these pieces and do it in a way that's compliant, reasonable, and not intrusive to the physician. Now, this is my favorite slide, okay? This is the economics of volume. And if you take nothing away from my comments today, I want you to take this away, okay? On the left is how much it costs to compute. On the right is how much it costs to do all your computing in the cloud, okay? So if you look at the top, the CPU cycle in your basement costs, in your house, okay, wherever you want to put it, costs between 6 and 27 picocents. One cycle of your computer, okay? It costs you about 6 picocents to store 1 bit of data for a year, okay? Now, over in the cloud, interestingly enough, it costs you about 0.58 cents to do a piece of computation. So it's about 50 times cheaper. 1 bit of storage, about the same amount of cost whether you store it in the cloud or you store it in your basement. No big advantage, but no big loss either, okay? Now, where's all the cost with data? It's in the middle. It costs to take 1 bit and transfer it, whether it's across your campus or from Maine to Los Angeles, it costs between 800 and 6,000 picocents. So the cost of moving data is going to continue to dominate. Since I discovered this, and this is work done by Radu Sayan at Stony Brook in 2009, in the last year I've had four large organizations look at this slide and say, I don't believe that's true. And they would have gone off and done their own numbers, asked me tons of questions, and then, gosh, that's right. Okay? And these are big organizations with big names, and you know, when they say it's right, I believe it's right. And this bottom box is, it's not going to change. If you look at the, and this is a huge debate in the community, if you look at the networking cost and where we're going with advanced optics and what it's going to cost to retool our backbone infrastructure, it isn't going to get cheaper. We'll have more bandwidth, but it's still going to cost this much money. Okay? Now, picocents, pico euros, I don't care how you want to value it, it's all about the same. And if you do this in joules, looking at the energy cost, it's exactly the same numbers. Well, you know, a little fudge factor there. But because it's all about the energy. So cost, data cost. So we're going to have to keep that in mind, that what we're doing is generating data that has an impact on us economically. So if we don't extract utility out of it, we're not doing our jobs well. So consider the existing data ecosystems. Okay, and I call them data ecosystems because they're kind of communities that build up and talk to one another. Okay, commodity internet. We've got YouTube, email, Facebook. You know, basically it's people talking to one another, hanging out. It's kind of a social thing. Business to business. Supply chain coordination, billing, customer management, distribution, Amazon, Walmart, all of them do it now. It's a whole ecosystem of communication, standards, data exchanges that are going on the fly. Financial internet, the stock markets, the banks, futures markets, high-frequency trading. PhysicsNet, of course they don't call it that, but the Large Hadron Collider and other slices of the physics community have created their own networks. They kind of pre-arrange with Internet 2 to move data around to these storage locations so people have access to it. Very smart, very clever, very pre-arranged. ESIP, okay, is a good example of a data ecosystem, and there's other examples. Now there's some data ecosystems that we can see forming right now, okay? Smart grid, just look at any of the IBM ads in any of the magazines. It's clear the smart grid's going to take off. We're going to learn how to control things more effectively. GE just made an announcement about the industrial internet, which is very heavy machinery, turbines, locomotives, power plants, talking to one another in order to try to find energy advantages and therefore reduce cost or reduce downtime. Healthcare internet, a la the 20 Epic sites that are starting to talk about really pooling their data, and that's going to be real. Usable patient records available everywhere. That's going to happen, okay? What is a patient record? I don't know. We're going to have to figure that out. One of the things we're doing at UNC Chapel Hill is figuring out if we can put the imaging and the genomics, stick them into the electronic health record. How do we do that in a way that we don't have to move everything around? Genome net. We've got to have a genome net. People are talking about it actively now, meaning how can I look at the 10,000 genomes in California that have been sequenced so that I can pool them with mine so I get better and better statistics on the variance, okay? Now, in all of the above cases, previous slide and this slide, I would argue that there are clear financial incentives in play, okay? There is money to be made or money to be saved, or people are going to be in this because something's going to happen in this space because it's interesting. But let's brainstorm. What other kind of data ecosystems might we like to see form, okay? ClimateNet probably has to be global, okay? Aquanet, I'm making up these terms, okay? The water, so we can look at water issues. Enviro Health Net, okay? Should be global. I think it's a global problem. I assert that in these cases, the fiscal drivers are not as obvious because we are a complex science. You are a complex science for the common good. That's a great thing to do, but I don't know who's going to make money off of Aquanet until water gets scarce, and then there'll be money made off of Aquanet, okay? So to overcome this impediment, I argue that we have to figure out how to do three things. Get some energy in the system, provide some leadership, and persist. And I want to spend just 20 seconds on the persistence. Energy, find people with passion. Start with a compact group and grow. That's what I heard. I totally agree with it. Probably needs to be some funding in this area, but NIH, yesterday kind of publicly announced that there's serious money, $125 million a year. Is that right? Approximately, around this data issue. You guys got to carve off a piece of that. Organizational forms that permit broader participation, because you're not going to have enough energy if you're limited to the elite scientists in this room or even your colleagues who aren't, well, I shouldn't say quite as elite, but weren't invited and unfortunately aren't here. And we've got to think about the incentives, because the incentives are the energy that goes into a system. So database citations, tool citations. I can't imagine why we've allowed our scholarship, such a critical part of it, not to be part of our permanent promotion and tenure record. Got to get there. Citizen science, crowdsourcing, branding. Branding is what the open source community uses to value contributions. You put a model in the maker movement. If you haven't read the book Makers, do yourself a favor, go out and buy it tonight. Okay? It's an inspirational book. In it, they talk about putting models for products out in the open source, and all you do is you brand it. And anybody who steals it and replicates it has to carry the brand forward, or they're ostracized. This has worked so effectively, it is amazing. I mean, they argue that the amount of innovation they get as a consequence of thinking about their products that way far exceeds the cost, the small cost. It's what the music industry probably should have done, okay? Okay, second big topic, leadership. You've got to figure out some way, and Rick, I think you've already come to this conclusion, to put together a framework that allows people to think how things might work, okay? USGS has clearly put together a great framework. That might be one that could be borrowed and adapted. And then when that framework breaks, it doesn't work, and that's going to happen. Pivot. Make changes. Be flexible, because we're living in such a rapid acceleration of change. There's no way you can predict from the top down how things are going to work in 5 years. Just impossible. That's what the universities are dealing with. How do we figure out how to change? We haven't had to change for the past 250 years. Now all of a sudden we're being forced to change. We don't like it. We don't, squeal whine. Okay? Final thing is, if you want to solve these problems, and you're solving incredibly important problems for my grandchildren, so it's a very noble cause, you're going to have to persist. This is complex science using very rapidly changing tools, and you're not going to get it right initially. You're going to get it right iteratively. So you have to be willing to do the things that for the long term and lay out a structure that you think is going to pay off for the long term. So with that, those are my comments. Thank you.
This was meant to be inspirational and not open for question and answers to bring us back down.
Are you glad about your family?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Cyberdyne Corporation at UNC, right?
Okay, well, I'm not going to keep you here much longer, other than I just wanted to thank everyone for being here. This, as I said yesterday, was a pretty difficult workshop to put together, and I think it's been really exciting, and the conversations have been really interesting, and I think we've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of data integration. I think one of the take-home messages that I was thinking about a bit, but became even more important to me throughout the process of this last day and a half is that it's not only the integration of data, but the integration of communities that we need to support. And I think workshops like this and bringing together people from different disciplines and communities is going to be really the way that we move things forward for this field. So I hope that this is just the beginning of this conversation. And I want to thank all the organizers, both at NAS and for this particular meeting. I know there was a lot of work behind the scenes that went into it, and grateful for that. And I don't know, Marilee, was there any logistical things? Okay. Okay, yeah. Liaison and committee members are in room 101 after this. So thank you and safe travels home.